Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of Aussie and global specialists and practitioners when it comes to multiplication and church planting. But before we jump into our episode today, we wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor for this podcast, The Church Co. The Church Co is a website and app platform specifically designed for and with churches and church planters in mind. And the best part is that they actually build the website and app for you, so you don't have to spend exorbitant amounts of time, money, and energy learning a new tool. You might think that this would cost a whole bunch, but they are a ministry. And the price is similar to hosting a website at simply $29 a month. Also, the best part is that they are based here in Australia. So they understand the Aussie church and are building amazing tools with and for the Australian church in mind. So we want to strongly encourage you to check out the Church Co, as well as some promotional opportunities that we have with them. That's all from us for now, and we hope that you enjoyed this fortnight's episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Friends, it's so good to have you back on the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast as we hear from a wide range of Aussie leaders when it comes to church in Australia, different ways that we are pioneering and seeking to multiply churches. And today we are joined by none other than an Aussie church legend, in my opinion, a good friend of mine, Noddy Sharma. Noddy has had a very wide range of experiences both in the church and working for non-for-profits, mission agencies, and now pioneering very new initiatives that we're going to get to today. But Noddy, it's so great to have you on the podcast with us today.
Charlie, it's so good to be here with you, mate. I've been excited about this and am so looking forward to our conversation because, you and I share this. We love the church and believe it's the answer to the world's biggest problem. So I'm excited. At the end of today, if we've just been able to encourage people to just keep going, keep pressing forward, keeping their eyes on Jesus, mate, it's going to be a good day.
Well, I'm sure we're going to get to that in a whole wide range of things. Your passion is infectious. We're so glad to have you on the podcast today. And I wonder, just for those who maybe haven't heard your name or experienced you in some of the different capacities that you've had over the years, maybe tell us about yourself to begin with. Tell us about your family. Tell us about the different things that have brought you to where you are today, even some of your ministry experiences. We'd love to get to know you first and foremost.
Thanks, mate. Okay, so in a snapshot, I was born in Darwin en route to Papua New Guinea. So my parents were missionaries for MAF. My dad was a pilot and an accountant. I know, funny combination. But, so I spent the first 9 years of my life on the mission field, as a kid. Absolutely loved it. Greatest adventure ever. It was so cool. My dad actually passed away after a 5-year battle with cancer and came back to Australia. And, like most of us do through our formative years, I went through a pretty tough time, really struggling with identity, struggling with thinking about a God who loved me that would take away my dad. It was hard work. And, then through some stupid decisions and being in the wrong crowd, just did some really dumb things when I was a teenager. And then Jesus fully just broke into my world when I was about 18. And my life was completely transformed. I was actually playing golf full time at that moment in time and trying to be a pro golfer.
I didn't know that about you,
mate. By a shot.
No.
Did you not?
Yeah.
Serious. There you go. So I played full time for about 7 years. And then, and really in that last kind of 12 months of that, felt like God was saying, I want you to do an internship at the church. And that was not on my radar. That was not part of my plan. My grand scheme was I'm going to be playing golf full time. And when I lost my sponsorship, everything came crashing down. I rock up to church and they do a call. They said, hey, listen, the internship's closed, but we just really feel like there's one person here that needs to actually say yes. And if that's you, come and see us. My heart's pounding in my chest. I'm like, oh my goodness, I think it's me. And I said to God, all right, if that's me, make it really obvious. And I didn't sign up. I left. But the next morning, the pastor rides his push bike up my driveway, hands me the internship papers and says, hey, this morning in my quiet time, God told me to come and give you this. So I just like, oh, wow. So I sign up and literally after, not even 12 months, I'm, approached by the church and they said to me, hey, we want to stop your internship. Instead, we want to employ you kind of just part-time, pay for you to go to Bible college. And one thing led to another. I ended up pastoring in 2 different churches for about 12 years and got ordained. And Then, flicked off and did a missions movement thing with OM Australia and was their CEO for about 7.5 years, and then World Vision for another 5, and now this new venture that I've just tipped into. So it's been a wild ride, Charlie.
Incredible. And tell us about your family. You're married. You've got one child.
Yep. So we've been married for 24 years and together for about 27. And Ali, she's just awesome. We've got one little boy, Jesse. He's just turned 11 in June, and we call him our miracle boy because he took 13 years to come along. So that was a journey in itself. But mate, he's such a little champion. And as a family, we also really feel convicted that God's blessed us so much. And so we do foster care as well. A lot of emergency stuff where kids come in and out of the house all the time. And our whole premise with that is if we can actually create an environment that is completely focused on Jesus and allow kids in their broken state to actually encounter something really different in their life, just even for a moment, then it's a good thing.
So good. Well, Noddy, I know in this most recent season that you are currently in and have come from, you mentioned that you were previously with World Vision. You did a number of different initiatives and partnerships with Barna around the next generation. For those who know you, it's become clearly apparent that your heart for the next generation is something that has been growing and growing and growing, and a core conviction of what you feel like you're called to in this current season. We're going to talk about what that looks like in a moment, but I wonder if you just kind of tell us some of the story of how and why the next generation, which it should be a no-brainer, but how and why has the next generation become the thing that you are most passionate about fighting for, willing to kind of really state your claim at in this season of life?
Yeah, sure. It's funny, Charlie. Like, I think, I'm not a natural youth pastor. Like there's some people that they just feel like, hey, this is my thing, the next generation. It's awesome. I'm going to go and chase that. That's never been my spin. But it's fascinating watching how things just unfold and kind of even reflecting on what's been birthed in your own heart. I think it started with this phrase that I said a few years ago when we were first doing some stuff with Barna, was around and looking at kind of really, Jesus movements throughout history that have done something cool. It almost always starts with a young person who has this moment in time where they're just not satisfied with the status quo. They can see something really wrong in their current generation, and they actually have the gumption to do something about it and do it before they figure out it can't be done. And, whether that's in church world, whether that's, your Billy Graham crusades, whether that's in mission world, whether that's even in a World Vision setting, like, that not-for-profit space. And you go back even further, like you think about William Wilberforce, right? Like he's in his 20s and he's standing there thinking about the, slavery just being undone completely. I mean, so I started thinking about what are we doing in our current generation to really help that next generation, those upcoming leaders, find a platform, some space, some advocacy, a voice to be able to express their dissatisfaction and live out their God-given faith, even when they don't have all the answers, even when they're not old enough yet to be able to do it. And then as we started looking through that more and more, and especially like I've got to call out Barna. The guys at Barna are incredible. Like if you haven't come across them, definitely jump on and have a look. They're US based, but they do a whole heap of global research. And the two that I had the privilege of really working closely with was around Gen Y and then Gen Z. And I think if I could encapsulate in this, the two big learnings I had from that, bearing in mind, I'm thinking through how do you help the next generation really find their voice. Gen Y, their call out was they don't want to just know something is true. They want to know it's good, And if we take a step back and we think about that through the church lens for a moment, the number of times we as pastors, leaders, the church, will focus on truth of who Jesus is. And now 100% we should be. But unless we go the next step of actually showing the goodness that means to humanity and the world, the kingdom of God here and now, then we're missing something. If we only park it in truth, but we don't show the outworkings of the goodness of God, then we're not capturing the hearts and minds of the next generation, right? And it was almost like this mirror back to us to say, hey, guys, stop telling us of just how good it is and show us. And so if we use the Christianese words for a moment, it means that we've been great at proclamation, but not great at actually living out the mission of God. And if we come back to even the Lord's Prayer and we think about the fact that when we pray that, there's a line there that says, your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, it's not just about the proclamation to say, hey, after you die, your eternal destination for your soul is actually with God, and that's what you've been designed for. Instead, it's this notion of, no, you can have access to the kingdom of God here on earth. In fact, you can take it with you, and wherever you go, the kingdom's goodness needs to be pouring out of you so that things change, people transform, even if they haven't actually given their heart to Jesus or not. And it's that part of it, that part of the equation, that two-step process of proclamation of who Jesus is and then the outworking of what that looks like in community. We haven't been great at that, And in times gone by, like I've said this from the platform too, that Australia is an amazing nation. Reverend Tim Costello used to say that if you had an Australian passport, you've won the lottery, right? Now, what he's really calling out there is that we have been a blessed nation, that quite literally, we've been a nation that has been designed and set up on this axis of what it looks like to be the kingdom of God. And I mean, we forget that we were actually founded as a Christian nation, almost this great experiment. And the thing is that if you look back and just look at some of the outworkings of that, so this is now not just true, but the goodness. We were focused on community. We actually focused on the underdog. That sounds like justice to me. We were focused on knowing your neighbors and allowing that community to intersect. Whenever there was a disaster in the world, we were first responders. If there was a bushfire down the road, we're actually packing up tools, we're jumping on planes and cars, et cetera, and getting there and helping out. We're doing stuff constantly. And where that comes from, whether we realize it or not, is this outworking of what a Christian mandate is of loving God, loving your neighbor, and serving the world. And that's the goodness of the truth of the gospel. If we fast forward to Gen Z came out and they basically, everything changed. The landscape went completely digital. All right. So now you've got these kind of two formational things occurring where you've got this digital landscape, which me in my old age, I don't really understand very much. All right. Bearing in mind, I grew up in Papua New Guinea, didn't even have TV when I was growing up. We had to use our imagination. Right. But all of a sudden it's digital. It's almost like a virtual world. And instead of your identity being formed within a real world, you've now got this struggle between the two. You've got a digital world where you actually have a digital identity, and then you still got to try and find your identity in the real world. Now, all our structures have been set up to help someone find their identity in the real world, not so much the digital. And so if you look at it, the way in which we've pegged it up is almost like in this hierarchical moment of, your family, your parents, a pastor, a leader, a mentor, et cetera, like it's very much from top down. And the idea that kind of sits behind that is that eventually as a young person, as you work your way through that way and you can sort out this stuff in your life, you'll eventually find God at the top. Now, in a digital world, everything is flat and wide. So the idea of trying to introduce an identity formation in a vertical structure doesn't actually equate to easily being translated into a digital horizontal structure. Because what happens in the digital world is that no one actually knows you. It's not about the really knowing you and going deep in relationship. It's about showing a part of you that you want to be seen, right? There's a lack of authenticity there, and you can get cancelled really quickly, right? So the problem with that is completely countercultural to the message of Jesus that says, I will never cancel you. I see you, I know you, I love you. So there is almost this, a loggerheads already with an identity formation and knowing how to live that in almost the tension between these two worlds, a virtual and the reality. And I think when Gen Z are coming through this, they're recognizing that struggle, right? And they've got a camp in both worlds. They don't actually know exactly how to be able to make that work in an authentic way. And so you see stuff coming out like 1 in 4 globally from 12 to 17-year-olds today on the planet believe they'll be famous because they're all carrying around, a platform in their pockets that they're watching people go viral on. In other words, being seen, known, heard, and loved, even if it's just a flash in the pan, right? And they think that's my identity. That's how I actually find myself. And the thought of that, when you and I were growing up, if you wanted to be famous, you had to be the top 0.1% of whatever field you're looking at, right? And now this next gen are looking at it going, no, to be famous, you just need something to go viral. You need enough clicks on it. And so that actually taps in to the core of who we are as people, where we actually want to be seen. We want to be known. But the question that we have to ask, and probably the answer that we have to help the next gen with, is seen and known by who, right? Is it by your peers or is it by your creator? Because by your peers will be a flash in the pan. By your creator is eternal. So, when we start to look at that and we start to think, okay, there's a bit of a problem here, right? What is the church's response? And the church has always been really good, I believe, in years gone by, at understanding the culture of the time and responding to it, resetting themselves up in a way to be able to respond. I feel like today what we've got is we've actually got the gap has increased between really understanding the problem and then coming up with the right solution to do something about it. And so we'll talk about it of saying, oh, it's almost like a lost generation. There's a problem. There's, an attack on Christianity. Faith and identity is a problem, et cetera, et cetera. But we haven't gotten to the point of saying, okay, so what do we do about it? And it's almost like this fear of, if we hand the microphone to them, if we let them actually lead out, what's going to happen? Because their theology is fuzzy. It doesn't seem like it makes sense. It's not what we're used to. And so almost like that moment of fear is, no, we can't do it. But, Charlie, here's the thing. We've talked about discipleship in the church for a long, long time. And what we've tended to do is program it. And what if this season is actually about not programming it, but just doing it and handing it over to the next generation and giving them one tool at a time to be able to do it for themselves with their peers? So, I look at that and think, huge opportunity. Here's the other opportunity I see. That I reckon that every time there's a revival, every time there's an awakening where people are just flooding to the Lord, is when the cracks start to appear within secular society of showing truly how horrible things can go when you try and remove the presence of God from life. And I think if you look back over the last even 5 years, global pandemic, everything shifting, everything changing, everything moving, safe schools, all this stuff that occurs, even sometimes under the radar, I think your average person can kind of look at that and be worried about where we're heading as a society. And I think what that does is that increases the chance of a revival actually occurring. Because the other really good news in the next gen space, that Gen Z space, is that they are more hungry for conversations of faith and more open to the person of Jesus than pretty much every generation that's gone before. And if you fast forward again to the alpha, so that's now 12 and under, you start to see the pendulum starting to swing a little bit away from just full digital, more to like dumb phones, more to this realization that actually real relationship is really important, and we're starting to see a foundational bedrock occurring that embraces the spiritual as much as everything else, and the mystery of where God could exist in this space. And so what that says to me is that this is a time that the church needs to, almost cast off the fear and take a risk to say, what does it look like to engage with the next generation that may be risky, that may be hard, that may be really uncomfortable, but what could happen? Because the Spirit of God, last time I checked, is at work. And in the midst of all the doubts that we have, that is where our faith shines. So I think for me, it's around, that's where my passion has come from in this. It wasn't I have this real heart for next gen. It's more around, I have a real heart for the church and I want to see the message of God go out and transform lives. And probably, with a missions background, if you think about a least reach people, I wonder if the next generation, Gen Z especially, is one of those categories. And it's not just a location now, it's across every location because it's actually a generation.
Yeah. And Noddy, you rightly said that's risky, that's intimidating for the current status quo of the church in Australia. And yet we also know when we look at some of the trends of particularly Gen Z, that innovation and creativity is one of the kind of strong charisms of that generation. And that's actually going to force us to be stretched, to grow, to come up with ideas and things that we've never even yet conceived or thought about. we're going to get to ways that we're going to release young people into that in time. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear particularly this kind of new project, this new initiative that you are currently pioneering yourself, and your whole heart behind that has come from what you just shared about the church in Australia and how we can best engage and equip church for the emerging generations. Tell us about Abel Movement. Where did the idea come from? Tell us about what you're doing. What does it look like? How can people connect with it?
Awesome. Yeah, so Abel Movement was really born out of everything that I just said, like seeing that problem and thinking, what can we do about it? And I think really for me, it's around not that I had the answers at all, but if we can provide something that almost acts as a catalyst, where we can almost prove something is occurring, it just makes it a little bit easier for us as the church, like with a capital T, to lean in to that space and give something a go. So the whole idea kind of stemmed from this idea of what would it look like to almost create church planters out of the next generation. So if you because here's the thing, right? Like you put a bunch of resource in people's hands and a bunch of structures and a bunch of things that have already been happening and have tried and tested, they'll default back to what it is they know. If you take that stuff away for a moment, right, and you actually just say, here's a problem, you work on the solution and we'll walk with you in it. That's where creativity and innovation start to actually thrive. And I think at times what we've done is we've kind of felt like, hey, the mission of the church needs to be left up to professionals, our ordained pastors, our ministers, our professional missionaries, et cetera, people with the giftings of evangelism and, the fivefold ministry. And that is that professional nature that comes out. Like, how do we do this as a profession? And I know this is sidetracked a little bit, Charlie, but one of the things I loved when Uber first came out, apart from the cool app that you could see where the car was and all that rubbish, but the thing that I loved about it was actually getting into an Uber and asking people what they do. Because you never get into a taxi and say, hey, so what do you do for a living? Because you would just be laughed at because they're a taxi driver. That's what they do. But the beauty about Uber was that anyone could do it. It took all the stuff that you had to actually do to get there to be a professional taxi driver. It took those roadblocks away and just put it in the hands of everyday people. And so it meant that you could ask the question, hey, what do you do? And some of the best answers that came back, like videographer, editor, et cetera. The best one I had though, baggage handler for Virgin at the airport. And he goes to me, well, I was driving already to the airport backwards and forwards. And so I thought, I'll just sign up to Uber and I'll just take people with me to work. He told me he doubled his wage that year just from actually adding 2 extra runs to his already working day. I'm like, that's incredible. Anyway, as I sat with it and thought about it, I thought, do you know what Uber has successfully done? Is they've taken something that was supposed to be done by professionals and they put it into the hands of amateurs. Now, the word amateur actually comes from amore, which has its Latin foundation in the word meaning for the love of. All right, let that sink in for a moment. For the love of. We often equate the word amateur with someone who's not very good at something. All right, but actually, the word amateur is around someone who is doing something because they love it. And so I looked at that and thought, how do we create a bunch of amateurs almost doing something really cool for the kingdom of God? And so that's where kind of Abel was born out of, to think with this premise of saying, could we take the next gen, could we set them up and create incredible amateurs that are almost doing church planting without them even realizing they're doing it? Could we actually give them a platform and a space to be able to do some peer-to-peer led almost discipleship, and all they've got to do is be one step ahead? No more, no less. They don't have to be gurus. They can just be complete amateurs and do it for the love of, and keep pointing to the way that when they're living out their faith, one step at a time with their peers, gathering them in, focusing on something that they want to see changed in the world, positioning the church, their family, their schools around them really well to create a safety net. Can they actually do something that will impact and change culture for the better?
And so if a church leader or someone who's hearing about Abel Movement for the first time wants to know more, wants to connect with some of the work that you're doing, wants to kind of go on a journey of what that could look like, how could someone connect with that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you just jump onto the website, it's www.abelmovement.org, or just punch it into Google, Abel, A-B-E-L, right? Not A-B-L-E, as in Cain and Abel. And I'll tell you where that name came from in a moment. But if you jump on and just jump on the website, you can contact us. I mean, we'd love to hear from anyone who is interested in doing some stuff, because we're right at the start where we're just piloting. So we're not doing this where we've got 100 of these going and we're actually be able to point to them. We're at the exciting front end of it, where we're able to say, hey, everyone, come in. Let's actually play with this. We don't have a set structure yet. Let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't. Let's actually try it and position it really well so that it can be replicated and hopefully just scaled. I mean, can you imagine if every school, every church, was doing something like this and had a cohort of young people that were just fired up around living their faith for Jesus, understanding their identity and winning their peers to that space? It could change the world. Like, certainly Australia, excuse me, certainly Australia would be changed massively, and the church would flourish. We would be able to actually point to beyond our four walls of the activity of God. So jump on the website, shoot me an email, get in touch. I'd love to chat with you. I'd love to get on the phone with you even, or jump on a Skype call, whatever, and just hear about your context, what you're doing, where you're going, how we might be able to help and partner. That would be super cool.
That's great. And where did that come from? Where did Abel come from?
Yeah, okay. So, it was so funny. I mean, the way this kind of came about was it happened really quickly. It was one of those amazing God moments of I kind of sensed in my spirit there was something stirring. I was very happy at World Vision. I wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. And all of a sudden, God just opened doors, and an opportunity for some immediate funding came to be able to start something. And, a great friend of mine, stepped into the space with me and just said, hey, if you could do anything you wanted for the kingdom of God, what would you do? And, so this idea started to come out of me and was talking about it. And he said, well, what's stopping you? And I said, I don't know, bills, food on the table, education, et cetera, et cetera. And then, eventually when that seed funding just came, they said, all right, we need a name. And so I was like, a name? And I was flicking through the Bible. My wife said to me, hey, Nod, I dreamt last night that God gave you a name. I said, oh, did he tell you what name it was? She said, no. I said, well, that was a useless dream. So I'm flicking through the Bible. And of course, at the very front, Cain and Abel. And I stopped on it and I'm just like, wow. And I reread the story. And here it is that, Cain sitting there and Abel sitting there. And one of them is falling short. And one of them is doing really well. And the question you got to ask yourself, if you're not pleasing towards God, what is your response? So your response should be, I believe, to go, okay, what do I need to do to change? How do I get better? How do I actually lift my game? What do I need to really focus on in my own life to be able to stand in the presence of God and know that he is pleased? Or your other response is, how do I remove that which makes me look bad? And unfortunately, that's what Cain did. He removed that which made him look bad. Now, by killing Abel, what he tried to do was to almost say, oh, okay, well, if he's no longer pleasing, maybe I can take that spot. And the word Abel in Hebrew actually means vapor or breath of God. And the thing for me was that even though Cain killed Abel, you can't kill the vapor or the breath of God. It exists. And when I look at, the comparison that occurs in today's society across that next gen, when I look at all the stuff that's occurring, when I look at even the way that culture has tried to remove God from the equation for them, you can't kill the vapor or the breath of God. I believe that vapor and breath of God exists in the next generation. And our job as the church is to call it out, give it agency, and let it flourish.
Come on. Noddy, I'd love to hear, particularly as we're talking about church planting and next generation at Exponential, we have a firm conviction that the church planters, not just of the future, but also today, are currently Gen Z, they're high schoolers. We think we need to start talking about church planting, as you've talked about already today, from a very early age, to actually say to young people, you can do incredible things for the kingdom, maybe as amateur, as we've talked about today. What would be your encouragement to our listeners today, potentially older church leaders or folk who have been around the church for some time? As we've talked about, that can be an intimidating prospect to go, hey, I'm actually going to invite you into this conversation. I'm going to say, how can I get behind you, empower you, make a hero out of what you're doing? What would be some suggestions or insights that you offer?
Yeah, it is a really tough landscape, Charlie, for sure. And of course, for any church planter, the temptation is to go back to what you've always done, right? And we do this as people. This isn't just a critique of the church. We do it as people. This is what we tend to do. We look at anything that's in existence and any model that has previously worked, and we try and do that. All right. So, within church landscape, if you start to think about what are the things that are important, right? Preaching the word, right? So our gathering tends to be around that. We all come in and someone gets up and stands on a platform and preaches and speaks. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I think it's fantastic and we should. I mean, otherwise I'd be doing myself out of a job, right? But it's not the only thing and it's not the only way that it's actually occurring, right? We do it with mission. We tend to put a missions committee together to say, where is God leading us, or have a heart for it? Then we think about families. Who is a person that we can actually have to really minister to families? Then we think about children. Who are the people that we can have that actually run a children's program that's great for a Sunday? And same thing for youth. Now, the problem with that is that I don't think the church was ever supposed to just have a bunch of Pied Pipers there, all right? You don't just come and play the tune and think they're all going to come to you. Because the message of the gospel at its core is confronting, right? It is confronting for a human being to, one, get over the hurdle of actually understanding that God exists, that, that shaped hole that you've been looking for, that you're going to try and fill, that Jesus is the answer, that the sin and shame that you carry as a human being, that is no longer a hurdle because of grace. Like, these are big hurdles to kind of get over, and it takes some time. So the yesteryear model of, hey, we're just going to build a church and people are going to come, I think we need to try and take a step back from that for a moment and start to think to ourselves a little bit differently of, what does it look like to almost be more undercover? What does it look like to not try and program something, but actually allow something to organically occur a little bit more, and start to ask the question of, how can I put my resource, my time, my talents into those spaces where God is on the move? And even if we think about this idea, right, like from a corporate way, my insight with this is, we live in a very clever society that talks about marketing a lot. And essentially what marketing does is that it looks backwards. It looks back in a moment of time and says, here's the resource that we put into this space, and here is the result of that resource, and what worked and what didn't. Now, as we move forward the next 12 months, what we're going to do is we're going to double up on what worked and we're going to remove what didn't. So we maximize the return on our resource. Now, smart, it's good, right? But the thing about movement is that movement doesn't react like that. Movement isn't about looking back. Movement is about looking forward and asking the question of, what is already gathering momentum? And if there is something that's already gathering momentum, how do I actually bolster that to actually create more momentum? And you keep the thing actually gathering and moving forward. What we need to do as the church is not necessarily look back to say what worked and what didn't. So in other words, I need my youth pastor, my family's pastor, my missions and this and that, etc. But instead ask the question of, what's gathering momentum right now in my midst, right? And especially around that space of the next generation. Who are the people that God's already anointing and got his finger on? And how do I get alongside them to continue to help them build and encourage them and keep that space of faith and love and grace and safety in and around them, keeping on speaking words of empowerment to them to actually make sure they can do more than they ever thought they could. I wonder if we had a bunch of churches that were actually engaged in that, rather than the look back, this is what we've always done. I wonder what could occur. Now, it doesn't mean shut your church down. If you've got a model that looks like your traditional church, it doesn't mean shut that down. No, it means allow that to continue, but create some space for the new. Create some space to think through, what am I going to do to empower whatever it is that God's doing in my midst in a way that I haven't even thought of before. My hope and prayer, Charlie, would be we would see a bunch of churches that would be so sold out to actually seeing the next generation take the microphone, have the platform, have the space, bring the stuff that we don't know about their generation into the fore, so that they can actually see it, do it, and be the ones that bring their own solution with their own language to their own generation that starts to actually point to the goodness and the truth of who Jesus is, so that identities can be formed and so the transformation can actually happen. And our role as the church in it, which I think it was always about, is to encourage and equip the saints for their work in ministry.